Welcome, viewers, to the Inside Interviews podcast, which is an enlightening series of academic discussions where we take a deeper dive into a variety of unique topics. After this episode, be sure to check out previous ones on our website, on YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Today, we are more than happy to have Dr. Mahjabeen Dhala. She is an assistant professor of Islamic studies at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, where she also serves as chair of the Women's Studies in Religion program and co-editor of the Journal for Teaching Theology and Religions. Dr. Dhalla's work focuses on retrieving the narratives of pre-modern Muslim women as theologians, exegetes, and activists. Her recent book from Cambridge University Press, entitled Feminist Theology and Social Justice in Islam, a study on the Sermon of Fatima, offers a fresh approach of exploring this 7th century sermon from feminist and social justice perspectives. Dr. Dhala also received a Wabash grant to conduct research on the state of Muslim female theologians and exegetes in the contemporary academic and community landscapes. As a community leader, Dr. Dhala has served Shia communities worldwide for the past 25 years in the capacity of speaker, teacher, and pilgrim guide. Today's subject, which will be on her book, which studies the life of Fatima Zahra, is one that is particularly dear and near to me because my master's graduate work was on this subject. I looked at it from a more historiographical lens, but anything on Fatima, I think, is an absolute wonderful contribution to the field. And we need more and more books written on this subject. And I was, after reading it, I couldn't wait to have her on the podcast. So we're so glad to have you. Thank you, Dr. Dhala, for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Khetia, for inviting me. It's an honor to contribute to this fascinating series that you have lined up.
Let's get into the subject, which is, and I usually ask most participants this, and everyone has a unique answer. So tell us a little bit about your journey to the subject of Fatima, which then obviously culminated in a monograph. Yeah, tell us a little about that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a journey. I think there are elements of this journey that have that emanate from my own formation of my identity as a Mawlai. I know that's a different word, but I'll get into it. And then that taking on the shape of my work in theology and also in my academic work on women's voices in theology. I think I owe this so much to my own upbringing, my identity formation. You know, you go through these activities when you're in a classroom setup or in a conference setup where people are asking you to sort of think about your core identity. And every time I go back into that identity, the answer that I so blaringly get is that I am a Mawlai, and this word, which stems from the word wala, wila, wali, has its root in a very unique kind of love. And I owe this to my parents and my upbringing, that whatever I was faced with in my life and whatever I did, the core impetus for that was love. Yeah, it helped me face crisis. It helped me dodge challenges. It helped me agitate systems. And I did all of that because I thought I was loved, I was in love, and I was doing it for love. And that is why I deeply resonated from the character and persona of Fatima, because I saw her as a passionate lover, a lover of God, a lover of her own identity, a lover of her voice, a lover of what she could do with that voice, and her love for the people and her love for her posterity. And I could see that resonance, because only someone who is either madly in love can do what she did and produce what she produced for for the Shia identity, I would argue, at least specifically. So I think my own identity as a woman, as a Maulai, as someone who has encountered landscapes of education, religious education, secular education, empowering women, and then to see this dichotomy of what God would want women to do as opposed to what the society or the culture would demand from women to do, and then the merging or the fusing of those two lines where Muslim women especially are doing things thinking that they're making God happy or out of the love of God, but that might just be culture, that might just be society. So within my own formation of my own identity, Fatima plays a very important role, and that has impacted my journey as a woman. And of course, I brought that with me in the study of theology. So I've had the good fortune of sort of navigating theological seminaries, both in the traditional context. So I've been to seminaries in the UAE, in Syria, in Iran, studied in all those different ways, got a training as a classical traditional Islamic theologian. And then, of course, since 2014, when I moved to the US, I've had the opportunity to, engage with critical research theories at the Graduate Theological Union, where I completed my PhD. So I think I was able to use both these tools and then start honing my academic journey inspired by Fatima. And of course, you attend Fatimiyas, you listen to sermons about her life, you listen to sermons about how she was killed or how she died, all the atrocities, the suffering that is associated with her within the Shia tradition. And I started thinking, how can I bring this part of her out within my own community and within the academia? So within my own community, the Shia tradition, you will have Fatima at a very reverential place, at this pedestal where she's only approached for maybe getting out of trouble or for asking a wish from God. Everybody likes to talk about her as this dutiful wife, as this supporting daughter, as this dedicated mother. But there are very few people who actually talk about her as an agitator, as someone who causes problems, as someone who agitates the status quo. And she does it for systems of structures of power within her own tradition. I think that is what makes her a problematic person to study and even to present, because she is critiquing the formation or the structure of power as created by authorities from within her tradition. So it's always walking on eggshells when you're talking about her. And this is the last thing I'll say about my journey, is I could relate to her because I find myself in this liminal space, when I'm in my community circles or in my traditional theological seminary, my voice was received as the voice of a troublemaker, as someone who does not belong on that table because of the kind of questions I asked of my own tradition. And then when I came to the US and I thought, wow, this is where I can actually speak freely and I can talk about this fascinating woman. And use the feminist lens to talk and uplift her work. I found myself unwelcome on the secular feminist table as well because of my, I think perhaps adopting my religious identity. I actually wear my religious identity. And in some of those feminist circles, I was just too religious to fit in. So I neither sort of belonged on the traditional table because of the kind of questions I asked, and I was not really welcome on the secular feminist table because I still want to hold on to my religion and my religious identity. So I find myself in this liminal space, and my friend there turns out to be this woman who is also in this liminal space, a person of reverence, a person of great historical importance, and yet she needs to be censored and her voice needs to be censored, and she doesn't really belong, and she floats in this liminal space. And I've started to think of that space as a space of power and not really a space of denial. So I'll stop there. That has been sort of my journey in my personal identity formation, and then my research in theology and academia.
My own perspective is similar to yours, but I see Shiism as a troublemaker. Fatima is synonymous with Shiism, or Shiism synonymous with Fatima. However, I mean, someone would want to unpack that. Shiism as a civilizational force in Islam, but at once a troublemaker force, right? As a party of protest, but at once, of course, a contributor to, to the development of Islamic civilization. But also at the same time clearly accused of being a troublemaker. It's almost as if Fatima stands in the place of being the kind of paradigmatic symbol of Shiism, right? In its very early genesis, or at least that's what would be claimed about her by Shi'is, by later later historians or people that were writing about her. And she is this person who is, the site of contestation, that there are different groups trying to claim her. And she's this really this figure that, almost, demonstrates where Shiism goes and where Sunnism goes. It's a kind of a rampart between the both of them. Anyhow, that's just my just how I tend to look at that issue. But speaking of the early period, clearly, the sources that you use in this book are the classical sources of Islamic historiography, and particularly Shi'i hadith. How do you deal with the issue of source criticism? What was the method that you chose for writing this book? In using, or at least in differentiating between what's primary and what's a secondary source as a writer, for the method and the purpose of this book, of course.
Yeah. Well, the source criticism is a very real issue to consider. I mean, whenever you're doing this kind of historical analysis. But one of the things that I resorted to was to challenge the power dynamics that were at play during that pre-modern era, and I would argue still continues to play out given the field of knowledge production. So it's always who is commissioning the work, who is the caliphate or the government in power. That could translate maybe in contemporary terms as who is offering the grants, what are the visions and missions of the grants, and who is going to receive that grant to do that kind of research. So who inspires research, who inspires and then also supports and funds knowledge production. So of course, the source criticism is always around the historicity of this event. And I think maybe here I should just say at the outset that although I have the first chapter, which is talking a little bit about, the life of Fatima herself. But I wanted to, and I think I make this explicit in the introduction, is that I am not writing a biography. I did not want to write her life story. That was one thing that I wanted to make clear in the beginning for my readers, because this was not going to be another narrative of her life. What I wanted to focus on was just the sermon. And even within the sermon, there can be so many things that can be done. There could be a literary analysis. I don't do a literary analysis. What I do is I just take the sermon and I mine it for two specific elements. One is the voice of a female theologian. So I want to extract theology from this sermon in the book. And The other thing was the stance for social justice. There is this woman who was thinking not just about her, but about how the confiscation of her land impacts women's ownership rights later on into the following centuries, and also all the people who are employed by women. When you take away the funding away from a woman, you also disturb an entire financial ecosystem that thrives because of that property. So the social justice aspect was also what I was focusing on. So for the source criticism, I always invoked what we do in our decolonial theories, or what Orientalism, what Edward Said says is, again, who is studying the other? And I say that all these things which we are now using as Islamophobic tropes, or tropes about Orientalism, can also be found in a micro scale within the Islamic studies knowledge production system, starting very early during the Prophet's time. In fact, after the Prophet's time, when the knowledge is actually being written down and gathered in terms of hadith, which then become biographical literature, which also becomes the source literature to understand and interpret the Quran. We have to ask, who is funding that knowledge production? If the knowledge production is being funded by the mainstream thought, by the political power at the time, then of course there will be voices that are excluded. So many a times when I would present this, before it actually came out as a book early this year, when I would present this at academic conferences, one of the questions I'd get, and especially from Islamic studies folk, would be, well, this is a great point that you bring about Fatima, her understanding of justice, or her definition of ethical leadership. These are great facts if this episode ever happened in Islamic history. And this remains, these were the challenges, or the kind of remarks that I got, that this does not have any historical purport in the Islamic studies, but it just exists in the imagination of the Shia tradition, how the Shia lived experience played out. So this is all part of an imagination. And my way of always, countering that or responding to that would be, well, I think the 2009 Pew Research Center report, or the BBC report, but this is again, like 14 years back, which says that there are about 200 million Shias in the world. So if this episode is in the imagination of 200 million human beings in the world today, then perhaps as anthropologists, perhaps as theologians, perhaps as women's studies scholars, we should be able to investigate this. And we should be able to mine these voices, even if they exist in the imagination of people. But what exists in the imagination of a minority doesn't mean that it did not happen. And we see that in critical race theory today. You see counter narratives, you see counter storytelling, which is used by Black Lives Matter. In different racial minorities will use this to sort of iterate their counter narrative of history. So just because it does not, although I'd argue that it does. In fact, I use Ibn Tayfur, who is Sunni linguistic from the Abbasid era, where you first find the written document, the sort of a written documentation of this sermon. It's not that it doesn't exist in Sunni sources, but I feel that to subject minority knowledge to be approved by majority mainstream documentation is not fair and very colonial in its own thinking. So that is how I sort of, dealt with source criticism. Of course, there are many sources cited over here. I've used Tabari al-Saghir. He's not the Tabari, but the other Tabari there, because of the last name. I think people get that mixed up. The 11th century author who wrote Dala'il al-A'imma. And then I also look at the 13th century Sunni historian al-Jawhari, and where he's talked about Thaqifa wal Fadak, and I take some narrations from there as well. You have Irbili's Kashf al-Ghamma, of course, he's a Shia thinker. So I go back and forth between the primary sources and the secondary sources. The secondary sources are mostly, what I found, where the work gets picked up in the 20th century. I think you have most of the work on Fatima either in the early, between the 10th to 13th century, and then you have a little bit of Ibn Abil Hadid going into his Sharh, where he talks about the khutbah, and I've quoted him there as well. But then I pick it up again of that impact that it happened with the different revolutions you see in Iraq and Iran and in India, in the subcontinent, and then sort of invoking Fatima again. So when it comes to source criticism, I think I'll stop there, and maybe we can talk a little more about biographies and methods as we go on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just going to get into the issue of biographies. I really like that chapter where you kind of sketched out the different genres of biographies related to Fatima, both classical and modern. That was a great contribution. I mean, the whole book is, but I really like that part because it's something unique. Yeah, tell us a little bit about that chapter.
Yeah, and as you know, biographies are always a challenge, especially when you're looking at women in context across traditions, but that becomes, specific for the Islamic tradition as well. So I've also done women's studies, as my method in universities. So you see this very common. You see this with secular women. You see this with women from different traditions, and there's nothing different about the Islamic tradition as well. What I argue is that the jeopardies are sort of multiplied when you're trying to investigate or resuscitate the lives of women who are connected to Muslim minorities. So if I'm thinking about a woman like Fatima, for example, then of course, just being a woman in the 7th century, that's a jeopardy in itself. That's a circle of challenge in itself. But then that sort of the complexities multiply because now she is in an Arabian milieu. She is also associated with a sectarian minority, which has been subject to strategic erasure in the first few centuries of Islam. And I would argue that that continues. There is a kind of curfewing of the Prophet's household, who meets them, who talks to them. And I think Madeline's book on the succession of the Prophet has made this very clear. All these different strategies that I'm hinting upon are more detailed in his book. But it's so difficult to meet these women in their given context and to report from them. And that is why the oral tradition becomes so important. So there is the gender, there is that the cultural understanding, then there is that sectarian polemic sort of curfewing of certain households. Who do you report from? Who do you not report from? That makes it so difficult for us to approach these women's lives and their biographies. And given the burst of knowledge production through Orientalism, because these are again minority women. Henry Lamens, for example, 1911, I think, when he published that book on the daughters of the Prophet. He calls it Les Filles de Muhammad. And when he comes to Fatima, he's only sort of repeating everything that is available in classical Sunni mainstream literature. So he's painting a picture of what is available as an outsider who comes into the tradition and can only encounter the mainstream tradition and has not probably looked deep to go into the minority knowledge production. So that's again what I argue about. I argue for the authenticity of knowledge produced within the margins. There is a lot happening in the margins, which is authentic. The pain is authentic. The documentation is authentic. The knowledge is authentic. and it deserves that position within knowledge production. So that's sort of, in biographies, there's all these jeopardies. There's the genders. There's the in my next work, I'm looking at African women. So there's the race. You have a genre that is produced by Arab and Persian scholars. Are they going to give South Asian women a chance? Are they going to give African women a chance? So there's a bit of racial discrimination that's going on over there as well. So within these multiple jeopardies, to be able to extract the voice of this woman had its own challenges. What made it easy was a sort of a critical look at these early sources. And this critical look at these early sources starts somewhere in the early 20th century. So you're looking at thinkers like, Shariati, and he's writing Fatima as in Farsi, but then this book gets translated, since it's translated in so many languages. And you'll see how he portrays Fatima there as this revolutionary. And of course, given his context and the context of the Iranian Revolution, you needed to recruit women. So now you're already seeing that this woman, who for centuries was a reverential identity placed on a pedestal within the own Shia tradition, is now being taken out from there and being mobilized to mobilize women to participate in the political revolution. So he's writing a radical new view of Fatima. Baqir Sadr is doing the same thing in Iraq, because of course his sister, Baqir Sadr's sister, Amina Sadr, is also participating in that revolution against the Ba'athist party, the Ba'athist regime, the Ba'ath party. So you need this mobilization of women. So what are you doing? You're sort of invoking that character of Fatima again. So he actually describes Fatima as this hero who walks into this battleground with the courage of her father and the courage of her husband, in her voice. And it's just beautiful how he portrays her in, Fadak in history, Fadak fit Tarikh, which is the original Arabic work. And then in the South Asian continent, you see Zishan Haider Jawadi. He's doing that in the Urdu-speaking crowd. And he's sort of saying, we can't just reproduce the narrative of Fatima as it has been produced in early sources. We need to do a critical analysis of history. We need to see how this character is applicable to the women's lived experiences today. So he is, I think, one of the first people who sort of invokes Fatima as a theologian. And he says, here she is. This is not just the voice of a disgruntled daughter. This is not just the voice of an angry wife. This is not just the voice of a denied mother. This is the critical voice of a activist who is fighting for what she believes is right. And that right is what she's in love with. So you see this new look, which is sort of paralleling the landscapes, the political landscapes, I'll argue, because we still have a lot of work to do in the cultural landscape and the social landscape. But you see this, and it's amazing that it's always men who are framing Fatima in a specific light. You see Mutahari's work on Hukuk al-Zen fil Islam, his book on women's. Again, he's sort of, retrieving Fatima, but they're all doing it to suit a purpose. See, we need women here. We need women in protests. We need women on the streets. So all of a sudden, women who are supposed to stay in the house are okay to come on the streets because you know what? Fatima went out on the streets to do this. So it's always, how she's been. And what I'm arguing for is, how about we just look at her in her own skin and in her own right as a woman and a Mawlai, in her own right. What is this person? Even within the tradition, I'd argue, I'd always do this whenever I get a chance to address a Fatimiyya. I'm like, isn't this great that we all come here and we sit and we wear black and we mourn Fatima and, the broken ribs, and we don't do anything about domestic violence in our own communities. We talk about women's leadership and we invoke the Fatimi and the Zainabi example, but out of the 300 odd Islamic centers that we have in the US, we have very few women leaders, at least on payrolls, resident scholars. No payroll for women's leadership. So there are things like this. I think I've gone way beyond biographies here, Dr. Khetia, and I want you to just stop me if I just run away with an idea. But
No,
this is what has been happening when I'm thinking about, you know, Fatima and her biographies and who's painting her picture with what lens.
yeah, I guess that's the question that perhaps pertains to all historical writing, especially about women. You know, through what frame is it being written? Because these personalities did not leave us their own autobiographies, written autobiographies. So it's up to later historians and scholars to sift through things and try to understand, you know, contextual motives behind, you know, the art, you know, what is written and why it's written in the way that it is. And why, for example, you know, what I discuss in my work is how Sunni scholars like Ibn Qutayba or others also try to claim for their own purposes, right? I could almost say that, I mean, the added layer to the question of Fatima is, of course, her feminineness and her gender, but in general, the early period, any important personality of the first generation of Muslims, especially among the first four caliphs, the wives of the Prophet, Fatima, would be claimed for any number of reasons. And yeah, this is what gives us so much to write about, isn't it? There's just so much to write about because nothing is straightforward when written about Fatima. Absolutely. And in fact, I came across a Turqi attributed to the 12th Imam, narrated by Tusi, I believe, in his Kitab al-Ghaiba, where the 12th Imam, it is believed to have said in one of his letters to the community, he says, Fi ibnati Rasulillah uswatun hasana. Very interesting, right? Or he says, Li fi ibnati Rasulillah uswatun hasana. So for me, in the daughter of the Prophet is the best example. And then he goes on to speak about this whole notion of the rida, of the mantle, you know, being placed on the wrong shoulders, and she, you know, objecting to that. So even the 12th Imam is claiming his grandmother for a particular reason. Very interesting. Anyhow, that's just that just came to my mind. Let's move on now. What are some of the commonalities or divergences that you find among the Shia thinkers themselves who have treated the person of Fatima? I want to kind of dive into this a little bit more. You alluded to it, but if you want to give us some more examples, you spoke about Ali Shariati, you spoke about Bakr Sadr. So Shi'i thinkers themselves have treated Fatima in different ways for different reasons over time. Do you want to kind of tell us a little bit more about the commonalities and divergences and how Shi'i thinkers have treated her?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've sort of alluded to that a little bit. Maybe
Yeah.
I can add to that. And I think if it's okay with you, backtrack a little. You also asked me about my methods.
Yes.
Yeah, the two methods that I used was the feminist approach and the ta'wil approach. If you think maybe it's appropriate, I could sort of hint on that question and then
Yeah, please tell us about that. In fact, I was going to ask you about that anyway, so go right into it. Yeah, feminist and the ta'wil approach. I think this is great, and I think people listening to this, also, you know, younger scholars can also learn about it. So why don't you tell us about it? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for posing that question. And I think you sort of alluded to it before, but I didn't hint on that. Yeah, and that should be a caveat that I, usually say because I embrace this passion for my work, again, in a decolonial sense, because for the longest time, we've been taught that you need to be away from your subject of study and it has to be an outsider approach. But again, thinking of CRT, the critical race theory, and other forms of feminist pedagogies, I think we should start embracing passion for our subject, and I don't apologize for that. It is it is part of feminist theory as well, that you make the personal political. So I'm not going to apologize, but it does come from a passion for the work that I do, and I've been doing for the last 25 years. Yeah, the thinkers, we talked about the thinkers. Your question was about, well, the commonality is an obvious commonality, and that is that um, uh, Fatima remains this undisputed linchpin of Shia theology, of Shia identity, the very critical connection between nubuwah and imama in its jurisprudential and theological essence. The jurisprudential essence then goes on into ijtihad and that whole narration. But she remains this, and I think she remains this linchpin for Shia identity, broadly speaking, including all different understandings of Shia Islam. So I think this is something that is very common. Her position as the daughter of the Prophet, at least the only surviving daughter of the Prophet, and in some Shia, especially in the 12 Shia understanding, the only daughter of the Prophet. The wife of the first Imam, the mother of the 11 Imams. So that position, that reverential theological position is a common thread that you find within Shi'i thinkers, and I would say Shi'i thinkers across, broadly speaking. But there are differences, of course. The differences are even within the 12er Shia thought. There are differences in how that reverential theological position translates into jurisprudential authority and social integration of women's voices, especially as troublemakers and activists. Wow, I think I've said a lot there. But I think that is where you see differences, such differences that we talked about Sadr, how Sadr portrays Fatima is very important because of the changing landscape in his own country. The way Zishan Haider does it, the Jawadi does it, the way Shariati does it, the way Majlisi does it, Abbas Qummi does it earlier when he writes Bayt al-Ahzan. It's all you're seeing the trends of those thinkers. I think. Again, I will sound a lot like Clohisi here, because Christopher Clohisi, when he writes his book, especially the one with Zainab, where he talks about Fatima's daughter Zainab, and he argues for the religious leadership position, and he almost uses the word imam, maybe he does, for these women. For me, it has been invoking the equality of Fatima to Ali. Especially when you're doing gender justice work or you're doing gender equality work, you have the mention of Fatima as an equal of Ali. And what does that mean? So if we were to just take that one tradition of the Prophet, calling Ali the kufu of Fatima, the pair, the equal and opposite of Fatima. Just taking that, what does that mean for Fatima? Is she Bad'atun Nabi? That's another thing. A part of Nubuwah? What does that mean for her theological position? She is part Nabi and equal to Imam. And she is, I would argue, higher in status to all the 11 Imams. As a woman in a female body, she is higher in status to all the other 11 Imams who are in her lineage. And I will substantiate or evidence this with the 11th Imams saying that Ummuna Fatima hujjatun alayna, that our mother Fatima is a hujjah upon us. And as we know, that the dynamics of the hujjiyah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the proof of God on others. So I look at this woman, and I think this is where I sort of go away from the different thoughts, is where I look at this woman or this person of God in a female body, embracing a female identity, who is referred to the Prophet as part Nabi or part of Nubuwwah, the prophetic mission, and equal to Ali, and whatever Ali stands for. And if you can think is equal, is she equal to Nahj al-Balagha? Is she equal to Badr? Is she equal to Hunayn? Is she equal to Wasiyun Nabi? So equal to Ali and higher than everyone else. And looking at Fatima in that identity, wondering how that translates to Muslim women, Shi'i women, in their communities, in their homes, in their jurisprudential landscapes. So one of the things that I would like to pull on, for which I'm not very popular, or maybe notorious even, is maybe in the ijtihad system that we have the nuwab, we have naibin of whatever mujtahid system you have, you have the nuwab or the attorneys of that mujtahid in different countries who are charged with different tasks. And we don't have a woman attorney yet. Although jurisprudentially, there is nothing wrong for being a woman and taking this charge, but it is just not culturally welcomed. So where I diverge, I want to say, or where I sort of raise uncomfortable questions for which I'm not very welcome in many areas is, you have this Fatima who is across the board this very reverential authority, but what are you doing to let this translate and impact Muslim women, Shi'i women's lived experiences? How is that happening?
Yeah.
And if it's like, why are you asking this question about a woman? I'd be like, well, isn't this what is taught with imams? The imams are, again, identities who are supposed to impact the spiritual formation, the identity formation, the humane formation of Muslim or Shi'i, or even the world, or humanity in charge. So I think, I didn't want to interrupt you. I had something to say, but that's where I'm thinking.
Well, I guess an issue that would come up is she entirely human anyways?
The mystical
Right. So she's part human. Well, she's human. I'm being facetious, obviously, but she's a woman who, according to some narrations, did not experience menstruation. Their wedding was predetermined in heaven. Her name comes from the divine names. Even the imams themselves, I think, in some ways, there's this whole notion of them, of their pre-existence, of their luminous nature, and there are elements of what they teach that can be implemented by others, but their personhood itself is forever inaccessible because of or if we were to go down the road of the divine guide of Amir Muezzi, then that's where we would end up. I think that poses another problem, doesn't it? Or at least in how these figures are interpreted and perceived in a theological lens, and whether Fatima, Imam Ali, Hassan, Hussein, the whole group of them, because Fatima says herself, and we're going to actually get to the khutbah of Fadak, imamatuna amnan min al-firqa. Right? So she includes herself in the imamah, hubbuna izzan al-Islam, and so on and so forth, right? She puts herself in the camp with the Prophet, with Ali ibn Abi Talib, with like Sharif Murtada, the way he puts it in Kitab al-Intisar in Bab al-Qada, in the chapter on judgments. He says that, well, what happens to the person who rejected the judgment of Fatima or didn't accept her, for example, her bearing witness? Well, why is that an issue? Well, he says if she's an infallible, then she's muftaradu ta'ah. If she's muftarada ta'ah, is the one that has to be obeyed, then there's no difference between her and Ali and no difference between Ali, her, and the Prophet, which now puts her in this whole different realm altogether. And in that realm, her feminine, is it in some way, if it's looked at from a certain theological angle, her femininity doesn't even really play a role when she's at that level. So almost from the human, when she's just become a divine guide. If it's viewed in that way, it all depends on the lens to which it's viewed.
Yeah,
What do you think?
yeah, of course.
I'm just throwing that out there. It's off script, but
Absolutely, no, absolutely. And it's not just for her, like you rightly pointed out. It's for all the prophets, especially given Shi'i theology. There is the concept of isma, a sort of, immaculateness associated, the kind of immaculateness that cannot be demanded of any other human. Yet all these immaculate human beings are role models, and
yeah, at the same time.
And they are portrayed as examples to follow, and have impacted law, have impacted societies, have impacted norms. But what I'm saying is, then where does Fatima play a role with her counterparts as women? Of course, women who are not women, who don't see a period, or women who have that kind of mystical dimension, but women in their own rights as human beings. And if these were divine guides, male or female, in male or female bodies, how does their role as inspiring role models or ideals impact the lived experiences of men and women within communities who profess or who subscribe to their theological relevance? Yeah, of course, that's a valid question. But then again, if it's valid and understandable for the male divinely guided guides, then how does it translate for the female, or a guide who is in a female body? Like I said, it's nitpicking at that hair, and that's the hair that I pull at all the time.
Yeah, and that's why I love your book. And that brings us to Fadak. Tell us about Fadak. I mean, let's just get to the heart of the issue of the time that we have left. Tell us about Fadak and
yeah, absolutely.
why it's
So
important. Yeah.
I have a chapter in there which talks solely about Fadak, even before the sermon. It's just about Fadak. And again, the two lenses that I used were the feminist lens and the Ta'wil lens. I used the feminist lens because that was the safest way in which I could dive into this khutbah without having, of course, people will look at my identity as a Shia and say, oh, she's doing this because she's a Shia. But I tried to stay within that resuscitating of female narratives or theologians from a pre-modern era. So I wanted to be devoted to that. I happen to be a person who is bringing in the insider voice, and I will not apologize for that insider voice. And the other thing that I sort of focus on is the ta'wil. And the ta'wil is, again, what I use for sort of deciphering a few things from the Ta'wil is like interpretation. I mean, exegesis, folks know this. There is tafsir and there's ta'wil. There is a superficial understanding of the word, and then there is a deeper or esoteric understanding of the word. And I argue in this book that if the sacred word or the scripture, that is the Quran, can be subject to a ta'wil, and it should be, because if the book says, La ratbin wala yabisin, there is nothing moist or dry that has been left out within the book. And if everything is within the book, then it's so hard to contain it between two covers. How do you contain everything between two covers? Well, one answer to that might be because the word has many layers, and there are deeper layers, and there are meanings, and there is reading between and beyond the lines sometimes to be able to fit everything between the covers. And I argue that if the Quran can be read with a lens of interpretation, which is ta'wil, then historical evidence also needs to be read with interpretation and ta'wil, to read beyond the word and sometimes maybe between the words. So that's just the two that I use, and that's what I use for Fadak as well. So Fadak has a historical reality, the Shia imagination did not create that landscape in their heads. It actually exists. It is part of this globe. It has an axis that you can see on Google Maps, and it's there. It exists. So it is a historical reality in itself, a land which had a history of its own, had a conquest and whatever. And then I do the historical analysis of that place. I also look at it with a political lens, and I say, now this place, which has a geographical reality and a historical reality, then also assumes a political identity. Because Fatima versus the first caliph, this becomes a political debate, because Fadak is a substantial amount of revenue, and in any political arena, you would want to diffuse the finances of your opposition. So if the caliphate is in power and their biggest opposers in those early days are the Ahl al-Bayt, the house of the Prophet, and the funding for the house of the Prophet is coming from Fadak. So when you take Fadak away, or when you confiscate it, you're actually freezing the financial capacity of your opponent. So it becomes a political maneuver as well. A historical, geographical, political maneuver. And then later on in the children of Fatima, you see that Fadak becomes symbolic. And I sort of narrate from the seventh Imam's conversation with Harun al-Abbasi, about where he says, can you draw me the outline on a map of where Fadak was? I'd like to return it to you. And then he sort of maps out the entire Islamic caliphate. And Harun says, well, what have you done? This is all of my kingdom. He says, that is what Fadak stands for. So now it's no longer a geographical location within a longitude and a latitude. It's beyond that. It's symbolic now. It's leadership. It's what Fatima inherited from her father, and that was the leadership of the Muslim Ummah. So you see this symbolic reference, and that becomes the Fatimiyya celebrations today, or commemorations today, are again symbolic of an identity. It becomes an identity, a Shia identity. It's more than a piece of land. It's also gendered, I would say, because Ali is not asking for it. You see, all the noise that is being made by Fatima. And you would assume, generally, a general assumption, if you think of a woman in the 7th century Arabic Arabian cultural milieu, you would think, okay, these are women. Yes, they might have some liberties. Yes, they might be, integrating in society, but it would be very rare for a woman who is associated in a reverential position as the daughter of the Prophet or the wife of the first Imam to choose a route that is a public route to make a public protest. So Fatima's home had a private access to the mosque. She could have easily used the private access and gone to the caliph and said, hey, what's happening? But she chooses to take this public route, which is really sort of, agitating even the kind of pictures that 13th century theologians are painting for a religious, pious woman. They're using Fatima to put in traditions like the best woman is someone who is not seen by men, or men do not see her. And yet you have this documented reality that she's walking from a public route within the aswaq, the souk, the markets, to the extent where the writers are writing that her walk was like that of the Prophet, reminded them of the Prophet, and the people started crying because she walked. So she's making this very embodied statement. So there is a gendered aspect. You would think, oh my God, the husband would have gone, even if it was the wife's property. But here you have the woman making all the noise. So there's this gendered aspect. And then there's a moral aspect where people are like, but the household of the Prophet are so generous, they're so giving. What would it matter? A few date palm trees. It wasn't a few date palm trees. And I've gone into my book and talking about the numbers associated to the assets that Fadak amounted to, the revenues that it brought. But anyway, it's like, oh, the Prophet's household is sort of a moral, the altruism you have connected to them, the sacrifice, the selflessness. But here you see that and this is the social justice aspect. It's not just her land, it's not just her inheritance. She is probably looking deep into the future of all Muslim women to come who are going to be denied their financial liberty and egalitarianism based on some religious concoction. And she's making that statement. So there is a moral license that she is granting in these early stage for all those women who might be denied based on religious concoctions. There's also the people who were associated. So the way she finds out is that her lands are confiscated is that all her deputies, all her employees in that land come back saying, hey, we went to work and there was this government guard there and we couldn't, go trespass that. And now she's asking for all those people who've lost their jobs. It's Fadak is now a source of income for all those people who were hired there. Fadak is a source of income for all the homes that was given out to the needy who didn't make it to the list of the government's treasury. So even the home system and the Fay system are so related, and she's making this social justice stance. So that's how I approach Fadak and the different dimensions with which we can pull threads from the narrative of Fadak. Stop there.
Particularly as a female voice of social justice, right? In the 7th century, and I guess for Shi'is as being the proof of God, right? So it's not only a feminine voice of social justice, but a feminine voice of social justice that represents for Shi'is the very will of God. And would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would say that activist model is there. The activist model to suffer or to take on a challenge and be ready for sacrifice for a good that will outlive their own time, that is not temporal, but will go on for humanity and will go on. You see that in her, again, like I say, I'm not doing biographies in this book, but as someone who is part of the tradition, you've always heard of Fatima with her bruises on her hands. And these are bruises because she's been milling the wheat on the stone mill. Or there's bruises on her hands because she's been pulling at that rope to get water from a well. And as a critical thinker, I would always ask this question. Wait a minute, there's this woman who eats so little, who has a family who eats so little. It's not like, I need something for breakfast. Her husband is saying, I need this for breakfast and this for lunch and this for dinner, or that she has a weekly chart like mothers do now, that this is what I need for Monday for my lunch for my child. This is what I need Tuesday. I can't repeat what I gave them for dinner last night. So this is not that typical household. So why is she milling? How much water are they drinking? These are people who fast for no reason at all, like for any impetus, they'll just fast. And what is she doing? And that's when you, as an anthropologist, when you look at the lifestyle, you see that very few homes in Medina had wells in their backyard, so to speak. To have a well in your home was a privilege. To have a stone mill was a privilege. People would borrow stone mills. People would borrow these apparatus. And for her to be doing this, she's not doing it for her family. She's doing it for all those neighbors who don't have that. She's taking water for all her community. So this is an activist. This is a social activist. This is a person who is enduring sacrifice and hardship to be able to benefit the larger society. And that is what translates, I think, also even in her stance for Fadak. It's not just her, it's not this her money, it's how monies will be allocated further on. And I think this is the last thing I'll say, is that Fadak becomes very close to the government, at least in the Shia thought or in the Shia tradition of the 12th, the Mahdi, the awaited savior, and this insistence that religious political and financial authority needs to be with the wali of Allah. Yeah, it's you find this thought changing in Sunni and Shia traditions. Political theory changes. There is a political leader who need not necessarily be the spiritual leader, or the religious leader who need not necessarily be the financial leader. And you find all these different departments. But here you have the Shia tradition that insists that there can only be justice if even the financial authority is within the power of a wali, of a lover, a guardian, a lover guardian of Allah. This is why we see Zakaria asking for a wali. He wants a wali because there is the property of the Israelites that cannot go to a non-divine person. You have Fatima, she asking for wilayah because funds need to be in the hands of those who fear God. And that is what I think in the Shia imagination of the tradition, there is this waiting for this authority that will unite political, religious, financial authority together, because the funds, the money needs to be also in the hand of someone who holds themselves accountable to God. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, we conclude on wilaya. What a befitting conclusion. Wilaya is just summarizes everything, doesn't it? And the wilaya of Fatima. Thank you so much, Dr. Dhala, for this enlightening, I don't know, eye-opening conversation. I highly suggest the book to anyone who's interested in it. Islamic studies scholars, people interested in gender. I mean, just historians. Check out the book. Thank you for joining us, all our guests who have joined us on this podcast today. Thank you for joining us, for listening to this far. Visit our website, social media, and our YouTube channel for more content. If you enjoyed today's conversation, then think about contributing to the Shia Research Institute to help drive more quality content in the future. And we hope that you will join us for our next episode. Thank you very much.